It is 2 a.m. in a dimly lit office in the Dzerzhinsky Square headquarters of the KGB in Moscow. The year is 1978. A senior analyst, a man who has spent 30 years perfecting the art of control, stares at a report on his desk. The pages are filled with dry statistics, intercepts, and informant summaries from across the Warsaw Pact. But they paint a picture that makes no sense. In Gdansk, dock workers are telling jokes about Leonid Brezhnev that were supposedly only whispered in the halls of the Kremlin. In Prague, university students are debating Western philosophers whose books were banned and pulped years ago. In a small Hungarian village, farmers know the real market price for wheat in America, a fact that contradicts the state-run newspapers' triumphant headlines about their own harvest. The information is poison, and it's seeping through the cracks of an empire built on information control. For the analyst, and for the entire Soviet state security apparatus, the source of this poison was a ghost. It had no army, it occupied no territory, and yet it was waging a war they couldn't seem to fight. They were baffled by an enemy that was completely invisible, carried on the airwaves themselves. Discover secrets like this daily on Cold War Impact. Subscribe now. To understand the scale of the shock, one must first understand the reality of the Soviet world. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was not just a political or military bloc, it was a sealed reality. En information forteresse. From birth, a Soviet citizen was immersed in a universe of carefully constructed facts. The party was the ultimate arbiter of truth. The newspaper Pravda, whose name ironically means truth, delivered the official version of reality every morning. State television showed heroic factory workers exceeding quotas and blissful farmers celebrating another record harvest. State radio broadcast patriotic music and speeches from party officials. Every book, every film, every play was scrutinized by censors to ensure it aligned with the Marxist-Leninist worldview. History was not a record of the past, but a tool to shape the present, constantly rewritten to suit the party's needs. Figures like Trotsky could be erased from photographs, entire events wiped from the collective memory. The outside world, particularly the West, was portrayed as a decadent, crumbling dystopia of poverty, crime, and exploitation. The Soviet citizen was taught to believe they lived in a workers' paradise, protected from the evils of capitalism by the benevolent hand of the state. This information control was not just propaganda, it was the central pillar of Soviet power. If you can control what people know, you can control what they think. If you can control what they think, you can control what they do. Dissent was impossible if no one knew that an alternative existed. Unrest was manageable if a local problem, like a food shortage in a specific city, could be isolated and prevented from becoming a national grievance. The KGB and its sister agencies throughout the Eastern Bloc, like the infamous Stasi in East Germany, were the guardians of this fortress. Their job was not just to arrest dissidents, but to hunt down and extinguish unauthorized information itself. A banned book, a smuggled newspaper, a privately shared thought these were not mere trifles. They were weapons aimed at the heart of the state. Into this sealed world, America introduced a weapon the KGB never truly understood how to fight. It wasn't a bomber or a missile, it was a radio broadcast. But to call Radio Free Europe a simple radio station is to call a scalpel a simple knife. It was a sophisticated instrument of psychological warfare, conceived in the early days of the Cold War by some of America's sharpest strategic minds, including George F. Kennan, the architect of the containment policy. The entire operation was initially and secretly funded by the CIA. Its purpose was not to broadcast American propaganda in the traditional sense. It was not the voice of America, which overtly spoke for the US government. RFE's mission was far more subtle and far more devastating. Its purpose was to act as a surrogate free press for the nations trapped behind the Iron Curtain. It was designed to be the local radio station they were denied. There was a Polish service, staffed by Polish journalists and broadcasters who had fled their homeland. There was a Czechoslovak service, a Hungarian service, a Romanian service, and a Bulgarian service. These weren't Americans trying to speak Polish. They were Poles speaking to their countrymen in their own language, using their own slang, discussing their own local issues, and playing their own censored music. They presented themselves not as an American station, but as Radio Free Europe. The implication was clear. This was the voice of a Europe that was free, speaking to the parts of Europe that were not. This simple reframing was a stroke of genius. It bypassed the natural suspicion of foreign propaganda. It was an inside voice, broadcast from the outside. The information they provided was meticulously gathered. A network of analysts in Munich, where RFE was headquartered, consumed everything they could. They interviewed recent refugees and defectors, debriefed travelers, and pored over obscure local communist newspapers from across the Eastern Bloc. They would find a tiny article about a new factory manager being appointed in a remote corner of Bulgaria, cross-reference it with a report from a defector about production problems at that factory, and suddenly they had a detailed, accurate story about corruption or incompetence that the Bulgarian state media would never dare to touch. They broadcast uncensored news about the world, but more importantly, they broadcast uncensored news about their target countries themselves. They would report on the strikes in Poland that the Polish government denied were happening. They would read aloud passages from the banned novels of dissident writers. They would play the jazz music and later the rock and roll that the party had declared a symptom of Western decay. For the KGB, this was an unprecedented threat. It leapfrogged their physical borders, it ignored their censors, and it spoke directly to their citizens in the privacy of their own homes. It was a phantom that was slowly, methodically, and relentlessly dismantling their carefully constructed reality, one broadcast at a time. The state security men who were masters of controlling the physical world were now faced with an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't arrest, and couldn't silence. They were stunned. The 23rd of October 1956. Budapest, Hungary. An officer of the AVH, the dreaded State Protection Authority, stands by a window in his office, looking down at the streets below. For a week, the city has been simmering. Today, it is boiling over. What started as a student demonstration has swelled into a massive, city-wide protest against Soviet control. The officer isn't just watching the crowds, he is listening. On a small, state-approved radio on his desk, he has tuned to a forbidden frequency. The signal is crackling, fighting through the low hum of the government's jamming equipment, but the voice is clear. It is a Hungarian voice, speaking from Munich, and it is describing the scene below his window with more accuracy than his own agent's reports. This is Radio Free Europe. It is not just reporting the news, it is making it. The broadcast is giving protest locations, sharing messages from student leaders, and reading the demands of the newly formed workers' councils. It is connecting disparate groups, transforming a scattered protest into a coordinated uprising. The AVH officer feels a sense of vertigo, a profound loss of control. His entire career has been spent building walls, physical walls on the border and psychological walls in the minds of the populace. He and his comrades were the gatekeepers of information. They decided what was true. Now, a voice from hundreds of miles away was tearing those walls down brick by brick. The crowd below is chanting slogans they heard on RFE. They are tearing down a giant statue of Stalin, an act of defiance that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago, an idea given life by an invisible broadcast. For the first time, the officer understood they were not fighting against disgruntled workers or idealistic students. They were fighting an idea, amplified and transmitted directly into the homes and minds of the Hungarian people. The initial reports sent to Moscow were filled with a sense of disbelief. It was as if a ghost army had organized the rebellion. The KGB was stunned by the speed and scale at which their control had simply evaporated, burned away by radio waves. The shock of the Hungarian Revolution forced the Kremlin to quantify the threat, and the numbers were staggering. Western estimates, later confirmed by internal Warsaw Pact documents, suggested that in countries like Hungary and Czechoslovakia, over 60% of the adult population listened to Western broadcasts, with Radio Free Europe being the most popular. In Poland, the number was closer to 80%. This was not a fringe activity for a handful of dissidents. This was a mass media phenomenon occurring in secret. The Soviet response was not subtle. It was a brute force assault on the electromagnetic spectrum. They embarked on one of the most expensive and technologically ambitious jamming operations in history. Across the Eastern Bloc, a vast network of jamming stations was constructed. Imagine colossal steel towers, thousands of them, dotting the landscape from East Germany to the Ural Mountains. These stations housed powerful transmitters whose sole purpose was to broadcast noise, a cacophony of whines, buzzes and screeches on the same frequencies used by RFE. This was not a passive defense. It was an active, all-out war. The scale of the effort was immense. By the 1970 seconds, the Soviets and their satellite states were operating over 2,000 jamming transmitters. The energy required to power this network was colossal, often diverting electricity from civilian homes and factories. The annual cost ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars, more than the entire operating budget of Radio Free Europe and the Voice of America combined. The Soviet Union was spending a fortune to stop its own people from listening to the news. But it was a failing war. RFE's engineers in the West were just as clever as the KGB's. They played a constant cat-and-mouse game with the jammers. They would switch frequencies without warning. They increased their transmitter power, blasting their signal through the noise. They discovered that skywave propagation bouncing signals off the ionosphere was more effective at night, so they tailored their most important broadcasts for the late evening hours when millions were secretly tuning in. Listeners became experts in finding the signal, carefully turning the dial on their shortwave radios, navigating through the static to find that precious, clear voice of truth. The massive, expensive network of Soviet jammers was a monument to their own failure, a physical manifestation of their fear. This was not an isolated crisis. The pattern seen in Hungary in 1956 escalated and repeated itself. During the Prague Spring in 1968, when Alexander Dubček tried to create socialism with a human face in Czechoslovakia, RFE became the voice of the reform movement. When Soviet tanks rolled into Prague to crush the uprising, clandestine radio stations set up by reformers coordinated their broadcasts with RFE. For days, they moved from location to location, broadcasting defiance, providing a lifeline of information to a terrified populace, while RFE relayed their messages to the outside world. The KGB was hunting shadows, trying to silence a resistance that was literally in the air. RFE systematically undermined the core of Soviet power by proving, day after day, that the state was lying. It wasn't just about reporting a bad harvest. It was about teaching a generation how to deconstruct propaganda. An official announcement from the party would be broadcast in the morning, and by evening, RFE analysts would have it dissected, exposing the half-truths, the omissions, and the outright fabrications. The invisible broadcast was doing more than just providing information. It was arming millions of people with the intellectual tools to think for themselves. For a totalitarian state, there was no greater threat. The dramatic confrontations in Budapest and Prague were punctuation marks in a much longer, quieter war. After the tanks rolled in and the rebellions were crushed, the real work of Radio Free Europe continued, day in and day out. It became a system, a relentless, grinding pressure applied to the foundations of the Soviet Empire. It was not a weapon fired in anger, but a constant, corrosive drip of truth that eroded the concrete of totalitarian control. The KGB and its allied agencies were not fighting periodic crises, they were fighting a daily occupation of their own airwaves. The core of this system was RFE's meticulous transformation into a surrogate national press. The Polish service, known as Radio Wolna Europa, became the most listened to radio station in Poland, despite being illegal. This reached its zenith during the rise of the Solidarity trade union in the late 1970s and early 1980s. When shipyard worker Lech Wałęsa and his colleagues began their strikes in Gdańsk, the state-controlled media was silent. They imposed a total information blackout, hoping to isolate the strikers and prevent the movement from spreading, but they couldn't silence Radio Free Europe. Smuggled reports and eyewitness accounts from the shipyards made their way to RFE's offices in Munich. Within hours, the news was broadcast back into Poland. Every detail was shared. The strikers' demands, the locations of sympathy strikes, and messages from the movement's leaders. RFE became the central nervous system of the Solidarity movement. It told a worker in Krakow that his counterpart in Gdańsk was on strike, turning a local labor dispute into a national uprising. When the government, under General Jaruzelski, declared martial law in 1981, arresting thousands of Solidarity activists and cutting all telephone lines, RFE was the only reliable source of information. It broadcast the names of the arrested to let their families know they were alive. It transmitted coded messages to the underground resistance. The objective was clear: to keep the idea of solidarity alive when its physical body was imprisoned. The result was historic. The movement survived underground, nurtured by this invisible lifeline, and ultimately emerged a decade later to dismantle the communist government. The Soviets, and their Polish proxies, learned a bitter lesson. You could put a nation under military lockdown, but you could not stop radio waves at the border. But the pressure wasn't only political. RFE waged an equally devastating war on the cultural front. The Soviet system sought to create the new Soviet man, a citizen free from the decadent influences of the West. Culture was a tool of the state, meant to be wholesome, patriotic, and ideologically pure. RFE's answer was rock and roll. Programs like Teenager Party in Hungary or Rendezvous at 6:10 in Czechoslovakia became mandatory listening for an entire generation of young people. They were a window into another universe. While state radio played folk ensembles and military marches, RFE played the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, and Pink Floyd. To the communist authorities, this music was sonic poison. It was individualistic, rebellious, loud, and emotional. It represented everything they were trying to suppress: freedom of expression, youthful defiance, and a connection to a vibrant global culture. The DJs on RFE didn't just play songs. They talked about the artists, translated the lyrics, and discussed the cultural movements happening in the West. This was not mere entertainment. It was a profound act of psychological warfare. It demonstrated to millions of young people that their own government was lying to them not just about politics and economics, but about something as fundamental as joy and culture. The objective was to sever the state's connection with its youth. The result was a generation that felt more in common with teenagers in London or New York than with the aging ideologues in their own capitals. They wore blue jeans as a quiet act of rebellion and passed around worn-out cassette tapes of Western bands like sacred texts. The Soviets were baffled. They had built a system to control the mind, but they never figured out how to control the soul. Perhaps the most ingenious part of the RFE system was how it weaponized the Soviet Union's own internal dissent. Throughout the Eastern Bloc, courageous writers, intellectuals, and activists created a secret world of forbidden literature known as samizdat, Russian for self-published. These were handwritten or typed manuscripts, essays, poems, novels, political tracts passed from hand to hand, a high-risk intellectual rebellion. A single copy of a work by Alexander Solzhenitsyn or Václav Havel might be read by a few dozen trusted friends. But RFE created a revolutionary feedback loop. A copy of a samizdat essay would be smuggled out of the country. It would arrive at RFE headquarters, where it would be read in full over the air. Suddenly, a document meant for 20 people was being heard by millions. The lonely, isolated dissident in his small apartment discovered he was not alone. The factory worker who harbored secret doubts heard those same doubts expressed by his country's greatest minds. It was a force multiplier for dissent. RFE gave these censored writers the largest audience of their lives, right in their own country. The objective was to amplify the voices the KGB was trying to silence. The result was the creation of a shared public consciousness of opposition, an imagined community of those who knew the truth. The Soviets were caught in a trap. The harder they cracked down on dissidents, the more powerful the material they generated, and the more compelling the broadcasts became for RFE. Through it all, the symbol of this relentless pressure was the simple act of tuning in. In kitchens, basements, and darkened living rooms across half a continent, the nightly ritual was the same. A hand on a dial, carefully, patiently turning past the screeching and howling of the government jammers, searching for that faint, clear voice. That crackle of static giving way to a familiar anthem or a newscaster's voice was not just a radio signal. It was the sound of a wall breaking. It was the sound of a truth that could not be silenced. It was the symbol of an invisible empire striking back. Inside the first chief directorate of the KGB, the department responsible for foreign operations, the mood shifted from annoyance to outright alarm. For years, Radio Free Europe had been categorized as a problem of ideological subversion, a nuisance to be managed with jamming and propaganda. But by the late 1970 seconds, the reports from every Warsaw Pact capital told the same story. The Polish crisis with Solidarity was not an isolated event, it was a symptom of a terminal disease, and RFE was the primary vector of the infection. The realization dawned in the drab offices of Moscow and East Berlin. This was not a battle for public opinion, it was a war for reality itself, and they were losing. The scramble was desperate. Directives flew from Moscow to the heads of the Stasi, the AVH, and the Securitate. The order was no longer just to counter the enemy broadcasts, but to liquidate their influence. This led to a two-pronged attack, one aimed at the technology, the other at the people. On the technological front, the jamming efforts were redoubled, becoming more sophisticated. Engineers tried wobbling the jamming signal across a range of frequencies to catch RFE as it tried to jump around the spectrum. In major cities, new, more powerful local jammers were installed. Citizens caught listening could face interrogation, loss of employment, or worse. The Stasi in East Germany developed intricate radio location vans that could supposedly triangulate the position of an active shortwave radio, a terrifying though often exaggerated threat. But this was a strategy of fear, and it failed. For every listener they intimidated, 10 more found ways to listen in secret, under blankets, with handmade antennas, the act of defiance making the information even more valuable. The second prong of the attack was far more sinister. If they couldn't defeat the message, they would eliminate the messengers. The KGB and its Bulgarian counterpart, the DS, decided to make a gruesome example. Their target was Georgy Markov, a brilliant Bulgarian writer who had defected to the West and had become one of RFE's most popular and incisive broadcasters. His program, In Absentia Reports About Bulgaria, was a scathing and deeply personal critique of the communist dictator Todor Zhivkov. Markov's words were reaching millions in his homeland, exposing the corruption and absurdity of the regime he had fled. The Bulgarian state was being humiliated daily by one of its own. On the 7th of September 1978, as Markov walked across Waterloo Bridge in London, he felt a sharp sting in his thigh. A man behind him mumbled an apology for bumping him with his umbrella and quickly disappeared into the crowd. Within hours, Markov developed a raging fever. He died 4 days later in the hospital. An autopsy revealed a minuscule platinum iridium pellet embedded in his leg, a pellet with 2 tiny holes drilled through it that had contained a dose of the poison ricin. The delivery device was the tip of the umbrella. It was a nearly perfect assassination, a plot worthy of a spy novel, and a clear message from the Eastern Bloc. We can reach you anywhere. But this act of brutal desperation was a catastrophic strategic failure. It was an open admission that they could not win the war of ideas. Their only recourse was the assassin's bullet, or in this case, the poison pellet. The murder of Georgy Markov became a global story. Instead of silencing him, it turned him into a martyr. Radio Free Europe, along with the entire Western press, broadcast the details of the assassination in exhaustive detail, including back into Bulgaria. The story of the umbrella murder became a chilling, unforgettable symbol of the regime's true nature. They had tried to kill a voice, but in doing so, they amplified his message 1,000-fold and exposed their own murderous desperation to the entire world. They had proven Markov's critiques more effectively than he ever could have himself. Alongside violence, they attempted infiltration. The KGB and Stasi spent years trying to place agents inside RFE's Munich headquarters. It was a high-priority target. An agent on the inside could provide advanced knowledge of broadcast content, reveal the names of sources back home, and sow discord among the émigré staff. A few operations had limited success, most famously with a Polish intelligence agent who managed to work his way up in the organization over several years. But these were tactical victories in a strategic defeat. RFE's structure, with its separate national services and layers of editorial oversight, was resilient. The information gained by these spies was often fleeting, and the risk of discovery was immense. The final pillar of their response was a clumsy attempt at counter-propaganda. Stations like Radio Moscow would broadcast in English to the West, painting a rosy picture of Soviet life. But their broadcasts lacked any credibility. They were peddling an ideology, not reporting facts. No one in the West was secretly tuning in to hear about tractor production in Ukraine. Their attempts to discredit RFE within the Eastern Bloc were even more pathetic. State newspapers would run articles denouncing the broadcasters in Munich as traitors, CIA spies, and dregs of society. But these attacks had the opposite of the intended effect. By constantly talking about RFE, they confirmed its importance. By attacking it so viciously, they signaled to the average citizen that it must be telling the truth. The psychological toll on the security services themselves was profound. High-level defectors like Oleg Kalugin, a former KGB general, spoke of the deep-seated institutional frustration. They were an organization built to kick down doors, make arrests, and control physical space. They simply had no effective tools to fight an enemy that existed in the air. Internal Stasi reports, uncovered after the fall of the Berlin Wall, are filled with pessimistic assessments. They meticulously documented the percentage of the population listening to Western broadcasts, the specific RFE stories that were spreading among the populace, and the utter failure of their own media to offer a compelling alternative. They knew, in their own dry, bureaucratic language, that they were being defeated by an invisible force. Their fortress of lies was collapsing, and they were powerless to stop it. The War of the Airwaves was, in the end, a microcosm of the entire Cold War. It pitted two fundamentally different systems against each other, not on a battlefield of tanks and soldiers, but in the invisible realm of ideas and information. On one side was the American system, which, for all its flaws, was built on an open society. The free exchange of information, art, and news was a byproduct of its very nature. Broadcasting this reality to the outside world was relatively inexpensive and philosophically consistent. On the other side was the Soviet system, a closed society that required a hermetic seal to survive. Its ideology was so brittle that it could not withstand exposure to unfiltered truth. This led to a simple, brutal economic equation that guaranteed Soviet defeat. The United States and its allies had to pay only for the cost of production and transmission. The Soviet Union and its satellites had to pay for a colossal, continent-spanning infrastructure of jammers, a vast network of internal security agents to police the listeners, and an entire state propaganda machine to produce counter-narratives that few believed. By some estimates, the Warsaw Pact was spending 2 to 3 times more money to block information than the West was spending to broadcast it. This was the Cold War in a nutshell. A dynamic, efficient system, outcompeting a rigid, inefficient one. The KGB was baffled not by a single piece of technology, but by the sheer productive power of a free society, a power that manifested not just in aircraft carriers and microchips, but in rock and roll songs and uncensored news reports. They were fighting a war they couldn't afford, against a weapon they couldn't see, to defend a lie they themselves were beginning to doubt. The ultimate proof, the final, shattering verdict in this 40-year war, came on the cold, surreal night of the 9th of November 1989. In a nondescript monitoring post in East Berlin, a Stasi officer watched the events unfold with sickening disbelief. For weeks, the pressure had been building. Protests were swelling in Leipzig and other cities, fueled by a populace that had for decades drunk from the secret well of Western broadcasts. They knew about the prosperity on the other side. They knew their government was bankrupt and faltering. That evening, a mid-level party boss named Günther Schabowski, in a moment of confusion during a televised press conference, mumbled that new travel regulations would go into effect immediately, without delay. This ambiguous statement on its own was nothing, but it was broadcast on West German television, which was watched by nearly everyone in East Berlin. It was reported on RIAS, radio in the American sector, and of course analysed and repeated by Radio Free Europe. The message was amplified and interpreted by the very media the state had tried to silence. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Within the hour, small crowds began to gather at the checkpoints along the Berlin Wall, the most potent symbol of Soviet control. Then hundreds, then thousands. The Stasi officer watched the feeds from the cameras at the Bornholmer Strasse checkpoint. He could see the confusion on the faces of the border guards. Their orders were clear: shoot to kill. For decades, that threat had been enough. But how do you shoot thousands of your own citizens? The crowd wasn't violent. They weren't storming the gates. They were just standing there, armed with a piece of information they had heard on Western media, demanding to be let through. The guards